Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Judeo-Christian Studies lecture. I'm Rana Berger. I'm a professor in the philosophy department and the Geisman Chair, director of this lecture series. Tonight, we are grateful to the Eleanor and Nathaniel Phillips Sr. Memorial Lecture for bringing Clifford Orwin to our campus. Now, as many of you know, we were eagerly awaiting Orwin's lecture on the Book of Esther last month when a snowstorm kept him in Toronto. I pinch it. It dawned on me that another biblical name belongs in this story. Cliff Orwin was scheduled to come to New Orleans to speak in the American Political Science Association meeting at the end of August a year ago when Hurricane Isaac came and canceled those plans. So third time's the charm, and we are really appreciative to finally have him here safe and sound. Clifford Orwin is a professor of political science, classics, and Jewish studies at the University of Toronto. After receiving his BA in modern history at Cornell and his PhD in political science at Harvard, Professor Orwin began a distinguished teaching career. Along with his long-standing position at Toronto, I didn't quite get the date you started, but it's long-standing enough. He has been a visiting professor at Harvard and at Chicago, as well as in Jerusalem, Paris, and Lisbon. I came upon this wonderful description he once gave when asked about his teaching, and I quote, "My methods harken back to an older kind of warfare. Don't teach until you see the whites of their eyes. Eye-to-eye teaching resembles hand-to-hand combat. Teacher and student struggle, and if they're lucky, both lose. Each is compelled to learn from the other." That's great, isn't it? I don't know if you really said it, but they say you said it. Orwin's scholarly papers and public talks cover a very broad range, from Plato and Herodotus, Machiavelli and Montesquieu, to pivotal texts in the Jewish tradition. He's the co-editor of a collection of essays on Rousseau, which includes a piece by our colleague, Richard Velkley. Meanwhile, he somehow finds time to speak and write on current affairs, including regular pieces for the Canadian national newspaper Globe and Mail. I first got to know Orwin's work through his superb book, The Humanity of Thucydides. Those of us who've learned so much from that book know the experience of the reviewer who remarks, "No one who reads this carefully crafted, wittily written study will emerge with his or her vision unchanged." I actually got absorbed rereading a little this afternoon and was struck again by how vividly Orwin's study supports his claim that Thucydides' analysis of societies under the stress of a protracted war speaks with real resonance to our century. Guided by his recognition of Thucydides' humanity, Orwin finds in the pages of this ancient Greek thinker what he describes as permanent patterns and dilemmas of political life. I expect we are about to hear an approach to the book of Genesis in a similar spirit. Let me conclude, if you permit, with a comment that I just hate to abandon, which I prepared for his originally scheduled lecture, entitled, "Will the Lord Deliver His People? The Comic Miracle of the Book of Esther." A couple days before the event, I don't think I told you this, did I? A couple days before the event, the Judeo-Christian Studies Office received a message from a local newsletter that was going to announce the event. Was there a mistake in the subtitle? They wondered. Shouldn't it have read, "The Cosmic Miracle of the Book of Esther"? Our secretary checked with me to make sure she got it right. "Oh, Rana, I think I made a terrible typo." No. I would have praised, if I had responded directly, I would have praised the profundity of a typo suggesting the comic as an avenue to the cosmic. I don't know if we are still on the horizon of the cosmic comedy, but we are privileged tonight to hear Clifford Orwin's reflections on this question: will not the judge of all the world act justly? Abraham's plea to God on behalf of Sodom. Please join me in welcoming Professor Orwin.
I want to thank Rana Berger for one of the kindest introductions I've ever received. I, too, am very relieved finally to be here. And my visit to New Orleans and to Tulane has been delightful so far, and I hope that I can repay your kindness. It's an honor, a double honor, to be speaking here at Tulane under the aegis of the Department of Philosophy and the Geisman Judeo-Christian Studies program, and to be delivering the Eleanor and Nathaniel P. Phillips Sr. Memorial Lecture. I've never addressed a Judeo-Christian Studies program before. I wonder whether it's not unique, whether it might not be the only one anywhere. Anyway, it's a great honor to be invited to do so. I should tell you a few things about myself, although Ron has already perhaps told you enough. I should make the point that I'm hardly a Jewish studies regular, and not even a professor of philosophy, but a mere political scientist, as she indicated. If you knew my record, you might well wonder why a hardened historian of Western political thought, whose CV features such usual suspects as Thucydides, Plato, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, should have stumbled into the very different landscape of the Bible. Actually, it was the trendy thing to do. What's all the rage among political theorists these days? The one certifiable growth industry within the subfield, the only one whose job numbers would delight even Mr. Obama? Comparative political theory, that's what. That means to compare Western political theory with non-Western, usually Islamic or Chinese thought. But biblical thought is non-Western thought, as for that matter is Hellenic or ancient Greek thought. You might think of biblical and Hellenic thought as pre-Western, given their later significance for the Western tradition, but pre-Western is still non-Western. So what I've been doing in recent years in my full-year undergraduate seminar, because we have full-year courses in Toronto, is to devote each year to reading 3 major works that deal with a common theme, of which one work is biblical, one Greek or Latin, and one Western. So far, for instance, last year I taught Genesis in a course entitled The Politics of Origins, along with Lucretius's On the Nature of Things and Rousseau's Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. Since Rousseau's work is a conscious response to both the Bible and Lucretius, that made it easier for us to compare the 3. This year, I taught Herodotus' Histories and the Book of Esther, just 2 works rather than 3, because Herodotus is so very long. Those 2 works share a common Persian theme, and with it a common concern with the question of despotism. I resemble Madonna in that Esther is our favorite biblical female. As some of you will recall, and as Professor Rana reminded you, I was planning to discuss her with you this past Purim until a storm intervened and required the resourceful Rana to upstage me. I ought to issue one final demurrer. I am Jewish, and so is my interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, inasmuch as I don't approach it as the Old Testament, which as such must be understood as the precursor to the New. I don't read it as Christians have typically done, as a series of anticipations of the life and passion of Jesus. Neither, however, do I read it as Jews have traditionally done, that is to say, through the eyes of the Talmudic sages. So I like to describe my approach, not entirely jokingly, as pre-rabbinic. By this I mean that I attempt to take a fresh look at the text, freed from traditional preconceptions, whether Christian or Jewish. As many of you will know, I'm not alone in this approach. In fact, Rana herself practices it. I'm merely worse at it. But I raise such questions as what were the concerns of the author or editor as framed by the expectations of his readers, and do these concerns still speak to us today? My subject tonight is Abraham's intervention with God on behalf of the city of Sodom. Among Jews of today, this episode tends to evoke a certain complacent satisfaction, how righteous Abraham was and how righteous God was too. That view, I'll argue, is somewhat facile. Like all worthy treatments of hard questions, this one doesn't so much offer a solution as deepen our understanding of the problem. Like all passages of great literature, moreover, this one can only be understood in context. Its immediate context is furnished by Abraham's exemplary hospitality to the 3 strangers who appear before him at his tent at the terebinths of Mamre. The broader context is that of God's calling of Abraham, which has proved an ongoing story. Consider God's previous appearance to Abraham in Genesis 17. There, in his 4th address to Abraham, God has disclosed for the first time what he expects of Abraham in return for his protection. and not just of him, but of all his descendants forever. And what does that prove to be? Not a scroll's worth of moral laws, no ratcheting up of the handful of laws previously given to Noah, for instance, but just one very specific, circumcision, and one very general and comprehensive, that Abraham, quote, walk with God and be blameless or upright. The Hebrew word is tamim. Abraham thus accepts the burden of blamelessness without receiving any guidance from God as to what this entails and without requesting any. Perhaps what we learn in chapter 18 is the seriousness with which Abraham accepts this responsibility, to the point of undertaking to remind God himself of just what blamelessness requires. Chapter 18 contains two distinct episodes, linked by God's interior monologue at verses 16 through 20. Of the first of these, I'll say little. Three strangers make their appearance before Abraham's tent at the terebinths of Mamre. While their guise is that of ordinary travelers, by verse 10, one of them discloses himself to be God, confirming his promise of the previous chapter that Sarah will bear Abraham a child in a year's time. He thus reassures Abraham, for the first time in the hearing of Sarah, that he will perform this crucial article of the covenant between them. In so doing, however, he makes no mention of that covenant, or of his promise to make a great nation of Abraham, or of the presumed righteousness of that nation. He merely confirms his promise of a son. In the passage that immediately follows, however, God's interior monologue, the long-term and broader considerations predominate. Abraham is seeing off his other two visitors, whom we're now told are God's angels, on their way to perform what we'll later learn is their mission in Sodom. Here we read merely that they looked down toward that city. God himself remains behind and launches on his interior monologue. Shall I conceal from Abraham what I am about to do? For Abraham will surely be a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. For I have embraced him so that he will charge his sons and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham all that he spoke concerning him. Here is God's clearest statement yet of the significance of his election of Abraham. Not only or primarily because Abraham will be a great and mighty nation, will the other nations of the world be blessed through him, but because that mighty nation will keep the way of the Lord and do righteousness and justice. We recall that in the previous chapter, Abraham was commanded not only to practice circumcision, but to be tamim, upright or blameless. Now God, in his interior monologue, suggests that the fulfillment of his promises to Abraham depends upon the righteousness of his people, on their keeping of their part of the covenant. This passage also gives us readers our first inkling, apart from the Sodom-ward glance of the angels, that God is about to perform some action, that he has business in Canaan today beyond confirming the impending birth of Isaac. What he has so far concealed from Abraham, the text has also concealed from us. We will learn of it only as Abraham does. Having thus far spoken to himself, God now turns to speaking aloud, although only in the hearing of Abraham. And he speaks as follows: "The outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah, how great! Their offense is very grave. Let me go down and see whether, as the outcry that has come to me, they have dealt destruction. And if not, I shall know." Again, this is not just the first that Abraham has heard of God's misgivings about the cities of the plain, but the first that we readers have heard of them. Note God's curious manner of speaking. First, he pronounces, on the basis of the great outcry that has reached him, that the offense of the cities is very grave. Then he steps back from this pronouncement, noting that an outcry is, after all, just an outcry, that is to say, mere hearsay, and that he really must go down and see for himself. Perhaps the cities are innocent. If so, he wants to know. He doesn't disclose how he'll treat them if they prove guilty as charged. He goes no further than to specify their rumored offense, namely dealing destruction. Is he leaving us to infer with Abraham that whosoever deals destruction, on him will destruction be dealt? It's hard not to suspect that God is playing dumb here, that he is practicing a kind of divine counterpart to Socratic irony, intended, like the Socratic version, to draw out his interlocutor, in this case, Abraham. Can God possibly be as ignorant of the truth about the two cities as he here pretends? Can his intentions concerning them be as unformed as he suggests? There are perhaps just three things that we can conclude for sure from this tantalizing passage. First, that the intended business about which God was debating with himself whether to inform Abraham was the question of Sodom and Gomorrah. Second, that by disclosing this, he discloses also the result of that debate, for he has now informed Abraham of it. Third, implicit but unmistakable, is that if the cities should prove innocent, God will refrain from punishing them. God himself expresses concern lest he commit an injustice. Doesn't this sound very much like a cue to Abraham to intervene? For God to punish Sodom and Gomorrah, or even any of their inhabitants, would be highly exceptional. Not since the flood, now many centuries past, has God punished anybody, whether a people or an individual. He has dispersed the builders of the Tower of Babel, but that was to thwart them, not to punish them. And he has done it without harming a hair on their presumptuous heads. Yet if God has punished only rarely, he has also done so harshly, as we think back to the flood. These might seem to go together. As Abraham infers, despite God's hemmings and hawings, the annihilation of Sodom is imminent. He therefore determines to approach God. Abraham came forward and said, "Will you really wipe out the innocent along with the guilty? Perhaps there may be 50 innocent within the city. Will you really wipe out the place and not spare it for the sake of the 50 innocent within it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put to death the innocent with the guilty, making innocent and guilty the same. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do justice?" As is clear from this opening gambit, Abraham presumes that God has pronounced upon the cities a total destruction. The famous discussion that follows goes no further than to consider whether this intention should be performed. It's a very precise, but also therefore a strictly limited discussion. It will also prove, in a crucial respect, a surprisingly ambiguous one. Now, before proceeding further, I will briefly turn to a modern, hence quite unbiblical source, Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, book of the year in Anglo-Saxon political theory in 1974. I was young in those days and still kept up with such things. Nozick makes the following point about criminal justice systems. If you design one to convict as many of the guilty as possible, inevitably it will also convict the greatest number of the innocent. If, on the contrary, you design one to spare as many of the innocent as possible, it will also spare the greatest number of the guilty. Enact a system whose priority is that the innocent never suffer punishment, then neither will most or even any of the guilty. Given the imperfection of every human system, there's no escape from this quandary. Even without having read Nozick, and even though the keeper of justice before whom he pleads is not human but divine, Abraham casts the case of Sodom as presenting this dilemma at its darkest. Either all the innocent will be spared, in which case so must all the guilty, or all the guilty will be punished, in which case so must all the innocent. Apparently anticipating the fire from heaven that God will unleash on Sodom, Abraham takes it for granted that such punishment will not discriminate between innocent and guilty. Will not the judge of all the earth do justice? This has long been accounted a watchword of Western civilization. It rests on two hidden but stunning assumptions. The first is that unlike previous deities, the one God who has so recently proclaimed himself to Abraham can be expected to make justice his priority. As we've observed, God has encouraged Abraham in this view by suggesting in his monologue that the question of whether the ill-reputed cities are guilty as charged is of the greatest concern to him. Abraham's second and no less crucial assumption is that this justice of God must be intelligible to us as human beings. He presumes, in other words, that however infinite the gulf between them in both power and righteousness, he and God share a common working notion of justice, which as such is no less available to him than to God. This presumption of Abraham thus implies an answer to a problem parallel to that of Plato's Euthyphro. There, you'll recall, Socrates poses the question of whether the holy, hausion, is such because it is loved by the gods, or whether it is loved by the gods because it is holy. Here, is the just such because God does it, or does God do it because it is just? The first view would imply that God's actions are above human judgment. God will do what he will do, and whatever he does will be just because he has done it. The second view implies the opposite, that as befits the judge of all the earth, God can be counted on to do nothing but what is just. In principle, what is just is intelligible to us as human beings. Each of us, after all, enters a claim, well-considered or ill-considered, explicit or merely implicit, to practice justice and therefore to know it. Nor by the same token is any of us slow to anger at injustice, whether toward ourselves or toward others. And this claim to understand the requirements of justice would imply that where God is behaving unintelligibly to us, where he seems to meditate injustice rather than the justice we have a right to expect from him, we are within our rights to demand an explanation. So just as Socrates' rationalist understanding of the holy implies a logos, a discourse common to God and man, Abraham here assumes an understanding of justice common to God and himself, by appealing to which he can, if necessary, deter God from unjust actions. This may not be something he would do every day or without fear and trembling, or in any case but the gravest and clearest, but the crucial point is that here he does it. Now, I don't want to suggest a biblical understanding of the relations between God and man is a simply rationalist one. On the contrary, it is somehow equally necessary to the biblical perspective that God's actions be intelligible to us and that they not be so. The Torah implies the impossibility of conceiving the relations between God and man in a non-contradictory manner. In the matter of Sodom, though, Abraham clearly does presume that he and God share a mutually intelligible conception of justice. Justice entails harming the guilty, who being guilty deserve harm, and refraining from harming the innocent, who being innocent deserve no harm. Perfect justice would mete out harm to all the guilty and to none of the innocent. Abraham does not question the propriety of punishing the guilty. If there were no innocent men in Sodom, he would lodge no objection to its obliteration. The question under discussion then is not whether it's just to punish the guilty, it is, or whether it's just to punish the innocent along with them, it's not. Rather, it is that of how many innocent would be needed for their claim to impunity to outweigh the claim of the guilty to punishment. For the sake of how few of the innocent would God forego destroying the acknowledged vast majority of Sodomites who are guilty? At no point does Abraham suggest that the city might harbor more than 50 of the innocent. He knows enough of the place to grant from the outset that the innocent could be no more than a tiny minority there. In the celebrated passage that follows, Abraham leads God by stages to agree to spare the entire city for the sake of just 10 innocents in it, should there prove to be as many as 10. The format of the discussion is the highly ritualized one of bargaining in a Near Eastern souk. Even Abraham's elaborate self-abasement, while still driving the hardest possible bargain, captures the etiquette of such negotiations. So this is a mode of discourse with which the original readers of the passage could not have been more familiar. Yet, if God and Abraham adopt the form of bargaining, they don't engage in its substance. Nothing about the passage, I suspect, would so have surprised its original readers as this. In any actual case of bargaining, where the buyer is the first to propose a price, as Abraham does here, the seller bargains him up. I'll give you 50 shekels for your camel, begins the buyer. 50 shekels for that splendid beast, I'll not take less than 100, right, replies the seller. Eventually, they meet somewhere in between. Just as the buyer hadn't expected the seller to agree to a price of just 50, neither had the seller expected the buyer to agree to pay as much as 100. Here, however, no such haggling occurs. When Abraham proposes 50 of the innocent as a sum sufficient to justify sparing Sodom, God doesn't respond with a counter-proposal of 100. Instead, he does what no actual bargainer ever would. He acquiesces expresses in Abraham's initial offer. He thus suggests to Abraham the possibility of actually lowering that offer, which Abraham proceeds to do. Abraham does his expected part by showing himself an accomplished bargainer. Note in particular how he frames the descent from 50 to 45 by stressing just how insignificant a number 5 is. Perhaps the 50 innocent will lack 5. Would you destroy the whole city for the 5? Having twice persuaded God to come down to 5, Abraham switches his unit of bargaining to 10 and proceeds downward without missing a stitch. Yet this virtuosity proves superfluous. However surprised Abraham may be that God hasn't balked at his original offer of 50, he must anticipate God's resistance to his lowering that number ever further. In fact, however, God offers none, readily acquiescing in each of Abraham's ever lower thresholds for the salvation of the city. So encouraged, Abraham descends as far as 10. And he said, "Please let not my Lord be incensed, and let me speak just this time. Perhaps there will be found 10. And he, that is God, said, I will not destroy for the sake of the 10. And the Lord went off when he finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place." We have now reached, however, the crucial ambiguity in the passage that I mentioned above. Note that Abraham hasn't tried God's patience by going below 10. We've not reached so low as 5, let alone 1 innocent, for whose sake the city should be saved. There are 2 possible interpretations of the position. The first is that the principle of the absolute priority of the impunity of the innocent has already been sufficiently established, so that for Abraham to bargain beyond 10 would have been superfluous. He's already confident that having acquiesced in a number as low as 10, God would have agreed to any lower number as well. So this conversation would anticipate the claim of the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 1, that God would have spared the city of Jerusalem from the Babylonians for the sake of a single righteous man in it. It would also foreshadow the post-biblical Jewish teaching of the Lamed Vav, the mere 36 righteous of every earthly generation, for whose sake God saves the whole world. Yet there's another way of interpreting Abraham's bargaining to 10 and no lower. It's that it expresses his concession that at some point on the continuum, the imperative of punishing the guilty will outweigh that of sparing the innocent. Abraham sets the threshold very high. If even 10 of the innocent would suffer, countless of the guilty must be spared. Still, he acknowledges that there is such a threshold, that if the innocent are few enough, they no longer warrant sparing a vast throng of the guilty for their sake. Perhaps this is the ultimate significance of the choice of the biblical author to present the discussion between God and Abraham in the form of bargaining. What this format implies is the lack of clear commensurability between the imperatives of punishing and sparing. There's simply no way for Abraham to predict how low God will be willing to go, or for us to learn except trial and error, where we ourselves would strike the balance. Until what point does the necessity of sparing the innocent outweigh that of punishing the guilty? Where does our judgment protest? This has to stop. We can't let all the guilty go free to accommodate the barest handful of the innocent. This ambiguity is exacerbated by a further one, that as to which of the interlocutors decided to break off the discussion. Did God depart when he did, but Abraham had nothing further to say, or did he do so precisely to preempt Abraham saying anything further? The text gives us no hint as to that. Was Abraham unwilling to seek a guarantee of impunity for any number of righteous below 10, or was God unwilling to entertain any attempt by him to do so? It remains then a question how we're to interpret the fact that the argument descends no further than 10. Still, it would descend that far, that Abraham would seek and God acquiesce in the sparing of so many guilty to preserve so few innocent. This appears to confirm the relative, if not absolute, priority both assigned to the latter task. The stunning aftermath, however, will call even this conclusion into question. Here I stress the important context context for interpreting the exchange between God and Abraham. That context includes what follows this exchange as well as what precedes it. And what follows it is the adventure of those angels whom God has dispatched to their mission to Sodom. The pace of the narrative is masterful. No sooner has God decamped and Abraham resumed his original place than the narrator spirits us to Sodom. There the angels enter as they had appeared to Abraham, in the guise of ordinary travelers. At first, the only of the residents whom they encounter is Abraham's nephew Lot. Lot has been sitting by the gate of the city, watching for strangers who might appear. He has undertaken to perform the duties of hospitality for them, as well as to shelter them within his house from such attentions as they can expect from Sodomites. These, quote, the men of the city, from lads to elders, every last man of them, unquote, now turn on the strangers and Lot himself with surpassable viciousness. In a dreadful parody of hospitality, they swarm about Lot's house, clamoring for him to yield the newcomers to them so that they may rape them. Lot seeks to dissuade them, even to the point of offering them his own virgin daughters in place of the strangers. The Sodomites make it clear that they'll no righteousness the likes of him. Quote, this person came as a sojourner, and he sets himself up as a judge. Now will do more harm to you than to them. Thus Lot, his family, and their guests would have perished but for the superhuman powers of the angels who strike the Sodomites with blindness. The angels then announce that they will escort Lot's family to safety as God has sent them to destroy the city. In the event, then, almost all the inhabitants of Sodom have proved guilty. The sole exceptions were Lot, his wife, and those of his daughters who have not yet married Sodomites. And the innocent remnant numbers not 10, but only 4. Does God spare the city for their sake? No. He destroys it utterly except for them. God, as it turns out, isn't the prisoner of his technology of fire from heaven. He also has rescuing angels to deploy. He can therefore contrive to punish all the guilty while sparing all the innocent. Is this the crucial lesson that Abraham and we must learn, that God's justice is not imperfect as human justice is imperfect? This sequel to Abraham's plea has exposed a flaw in his position, I think. He is a nomad, unversed in the consequences of city life. He conceives of Sodom not as a community, but as two throngs of individuals, the tiny throng of the innocent and the much larger one of the guilty. He implicitly treats their proximity to each other as a matter of indifference to both, except insofar as the innocent thereby risk ensnarement in God's punishment of the guilty. With the chastisement of Sodom looming, this is the injustice with which Abraham is preoccupied and which he hopes to avert by persuading God to spare the city. Were he successful, he would merely perpetuate the status quo in which the two groups live intermingled. Yet it is precisely the status quo that has driven God to the brink of his extraordinary intervention. As the adventure of the angels has reminded us, the continued predominance of the guilty poses an intolerable threat to the innocent. Not only are the latter inevitably at the mercy of the former, but their very innocence is a reproach to them. Weak and wavering as the narrative otherwise shows Lot to be, he could not oppose the atrocious designs of the Sodomites, thus courting destruction at their hands. As this episode therefore confirms, punishing the guilty is no less urgent a task for us than sparing the innocent. If, as Abraham stated, the punishment of the guilty is intolerable, which entails also the suffering of the innocent, so too intolerable is the impunity of those guilty, not least because it too inevitably entertains a threat to the innocent, entails a threat to the innocent. In his concern lest the innocent suffer from God's extremely rare chastisement of the guilty, Abraham had overlooked their daily sufferings at the hands of those very guilty, as instanced by the case of Sodom itself. Suppose that God had spared the entire city of Sodom for the sake of the merely fortunate to be found there, thereby confirming that his interpretation of Abraham's principle was the absolutist one. Or suppose that the angels had succeeded in discovering another 6 innocents there, rounding up the number to the stipulated 10, In either of those cases, God's promise to Abraham bound him to preserve the city. Would that outcome have cheered us? As chapter 19 discloses, not at all, or at any rate, it should not have cheered us. To spare a city like Sodom, in which the guilty so vastly outnumber the innocent, would be to consign those few innocent to a living hell. Surely this cannot have been Abraham's intention in bargaining with God as he did. And surely God acquiesced in the bargain only because he already knew 10 righteous men were not to be found in Sodom, as well as that he would not, on that account, be compelled to engulf the righteous along with the wicked. The angels announced to Lot that God has sent them to destroy the city, thus implying that his intention was already firm prior to his exchange with Abraham, because the angels had set out for Sodom immediately prior to that exchange. Yet since God, in fact, reserves the destruction of the city to himself, it's prior from the city is destroyed, we must think that the angel's mission was that of rescue. It's easy to sympathize with Abraham's position in his dialogue with God, the more so in that God himself it appears to do so. How unjust it is to punish the innocent along with the guilty, and so attempting to arrange human affairs primarily to avoid that outcome. And yet Abraham, righteous, is but a man, and like every human character in the Torah, falls far short of perfect wisdom. The episode as a whole teaches what Abraham has failed to grasp, that solicitude for the innocent cannot, without self-contradiction, support leniency toward the guilty. The justice for which Abraham pleads is one-sided. Will not the judge of all the earth deal justly proves as potent an objection to the policy he urges on God as to that from which he would deter. Justice no more permits us to treat the guilty as if they were innocent than the innocent as if they were guilty. God's justice, as displayed in the case of Sodom, avoids both these pitfalls. The evidence, however, confirms that of our experience. God reserves his intervention for highly exceptional cases. Only where human beings have abandoned justice entirely will God step in to vindicate it, and only by violating them. Otherwise, the obligation of enforcing justice remains with us, as God had declared when the flood had subsided, whosoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. We can't leave it to God to punish the guilty, nor may we avoid this obligation on the grounds that given the imperfection of human justice, it will inevitably harm also some of the innocent. This leaves us where you might expect the Torah to leave us, with much demanded of us. We can't turn to God to resolve our dilemmas of justice for us. We must do our human best to combine the opposed but complementary imperatives of punishing as many of the guilty as possible while sparing as many of the innocent. Taken as a whole, the episode cautions us not to slight either task by assuming the priority of the other. Thank you.